All right, gang, let's go to March 26th reading and see what God has for us today. We are transitioning from Judges today to Samuel. And so as we move into 1st and 2nd Samuel, we have a brand new feature film to start us out with. And if you two want to turn off your video cameras and mute yourselves for the film, that would be great. And let's go ahead and get started.
The books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. They're two separate books in our modern Bibles, but that division is due simply to scroll length. It was originally written as one coherent story. We're just going to cover the book of 1 Samuel in this video. So after Israel was rescued from slavery in Egypt, they made a covenant with God at Mount Sinai and eventually came into the Promised Land. And there, Israel was supposed to be faithful to God and obey the covenant commands. Before the book of Samuel, Judges showed how Israel failed at that task big time. It was a period of moral chaos, and it showed Israel's need for wise, faithful leaders. The book of Samuel provides an answer to that need. The book of Samuel's story focuses on three main characters: the prophet Samuel, where the book gets its name, and then King Saul, and after that, King David. And all three of them transitioned Israel from a group of tribes ruled by judges into a unified kingdom ruled by King David in Jerusalem. And the book of Samuel has a fascinating design that weaves the story of these three characters together in four main parts. Samuel, he's the key leader and prophet in the first section of the book, but then he also plays a key role in the next section, which is Saul's story, and it's told in two movements: Saul's rise to power and then his failures. And the second part is about his downfall and his tragic death. And then the drama of Saul's demise is matched by David's exciting rise to power. And then David's story is told in two movements. First, he rides the wave of his success, followed by his own tragic failure and the slow self-destruction of his family and then his kingdom. The book concludes with an epilogue that reflects back over the whole story. So let's dive in and see how this all unfolds. Part 1 picks up from the chaos of the book of Judges, and we're introduced to a touching story about a woman named Hannah. And she's grieved because she has never been able to have children. And by God's grace, she finally has a son named Samuel. And in joy, she sings this amazing poem in chapter 2. And the poem is all about how God opposes the proud and exalts the humble, about how despite tragedies and human evil, God is working out his purposes in history. And also it's about how God will one day raise up an anointed king for his people. Now, Hannah's poem has been placed here at the beginning of the book to introduce these key themes that we're going to see throughout the whole story, like the next one. Samuel grows up and becomes a great prophet and leader for the people of Israel, at the same time that the Philistines rise to power as Israel's arch nemesis. And in this crucial battle, the Israelites get arrogant, and instead of praying and asking God for help, they trot out the Ark of the Covenant as this kind of magic trophy that will automatically grant them victory in battle. And so because of their arrogant presumption, God allows Israel to lose the battle and the ark is stolen. So the Philistines, they take the ark and they place it in the temple of their god, Dagon. And then the God of Israel defeats the Philistines and the god Dagon without an army by sending plagues on the people. And then the Philistines don't want the ark anymore, obviously, and they send it back to Israel. And the point of this little story seems to be this: God is not Israel's trophy, and he opposes pride among the Philistines, but also among his own people. And so Israel needs to remain humble and obedient if they want to experience God's covenant blessing, which opens up into the next large section. The Israelites come to Samuel and they say, hey, we want a king like all the other nations have. Go find one for us. And so Samuel, he's kind of ticked off and he goes to consult with God. And God says, yes, their motives are all wrong, but if a king is what they want, give them one. And so we're introduced to the figure of Saul. Now, Saul is a tragic figure because he begins full of promise. He's tall, he's good looking, he's a perfect candidate for a king. But he has deep character flaws. He's dishonest, he lacks integrity, and he seems incapable of acknowledging his own mistakes. And so these flaws become his downfall. He wins some battles at the beginning, but his flaws run so deep, he eventually disqualifies himself by blatantly disobeying God's commands. And so the aging Samuel confronts Saul and Israel. He had warned the people that they would only benefit from a king who's humble and faithful to God. Otherwise, the kings of Israel will bring ruin. So he informs Saul that God is going to raise up a new king to replace him. And so Saul's downfall begins, as God at the same time is working behind the scenes to raise up that new king. It's an insignificant shepherd boy named David. He's the least likely candidate to be king, but the famous story of David and Goliath shows that God's choice of David is not based on his family status, but simply on his radical and humble trust in the God of Israel. And so this story embodies all of the themes of Hannah's poem. Proud Saul and Goliath are brought low, while humble David is exalted. From here, we watch Saul slowly descend into madness, while David rises to power. So David starts working for Saul as a general, and he's winning all of the battles, and he's also winning all of the fame. And so Saul gets jealous, and he starts chasing David around, hunting him, trying to kill him. David's done nothing wrong, and so David simply runs and waits in the wilderness. And here we see David's true character. He has multiple opportunities to kill Saul, but he doesn't. He simply trusts that despite Saul's evil, God will raise up a king for his people. What's interesting, too, is that many of the poems of David that you find in the book of Psalms are linked to this very period of his life, and they all express the same attitude of trust. And so this section of the book ends with Saul coming to a grisly death after losing a battle with the Philistines. 1 Samuel tells some of the most intricate, well-told stories you find anywhere in the Bible, and the characters Saul and David, they're portrayed very realistically. And the author's putting them forward as character studies so that you can find yourself in them. So in Saul's story, we see a warning. It's crucial that we reflect on our own character flaws and how they harm us and other people. And with God's help, we need to humble ourselves and deal with our dark side so that Saul's story doesn't become ours. David, on the other hand, is presented as an example of patience and trust in God's timing in our lives. And so he's running in the wilderness, being chased by Saul. David had every reason to think that God had abandoned him, but that's not what he thinks. And so David's story encourages us to trust that despite human evil, God is working out his purposes to oppose the proud and to exalt the humble. And that's what 1 Samuel is all about.
All righty. March 26. With the period of the judges coming to a close, attention now focuses upon a person of unique status. Born in response to his barren mother's prayers, Samuel is the last of Israel's judges, one of its many prophets, and anointer of its first king. As seen even in the laws given to Moses, God has already anticipated his people's desire to have a human king, just as the nations around them. And the time is drawing near for God to grant that which he knows will only be destructive to the nation of Israel. With the land of Canaan substantially under Israel's control, it is time for the inevitable transformation from a theocracy to a monarchy. The record of this 465-year period of the kings is contained principally in the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. As this record unfolds, the monarchy will both thrive and suffer under 3 major kings, then divide into 2 smaller kingdoms ruled by a succession of kings, some good, many more bad, before God's people are overthrown and taken into captivity by foreign powers. There was a certain man from Ramathaim, a Zuphlite, from the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, son of Jeroham, son of Eliu, whose name was Elkanah, son of Jeroham, the son of Elihu, son of Tohu, son of Zuph, son of Ephraimite. He had two wives and one was called Hannah and the other Phinehah. Phinehah had children, but Hannah had none. Year after year, this man went up from his town to worship and sacrifice to the Lord Almighty at Shiloh, where Hophni and Phinehah had two sons named Eli. And the two sons of Eli were priests of the Lord. Whenever the day came for Elkanah to sacrifice, he would give a portion of the meat to his wife Phinehah and her two sons and daughters. But to Hannah, he gave a double portion because he loved her, and the Lord had closed her womb. Because the Lord had closed Hannah's womb, her rival kept provoking her in order to irritate her. This went on year after year. Whenever Hannah went up to the house of the Lord, her rival provoked her till she wept and would not eat. Her husband, Elkanah, would say to her, Hannah, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you downhearted? Why don't I mean more to you than 10 sons? Once, when they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh, Hannah stood up, and Eli the priest was sitting in his chair by the doorpost of the Lord's house. In her deep anguish, Hannah prayed to the Lord, weeping bitterly. She made a vow, saying, Lord Almighty, if you will only look on your servant's misery and remember me and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head.
As she kept on praying to the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying in her heart, and her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. Eli thought she was drunk and said to her, How long are you going to stay drunk? Put away your wine. Not so, my lord, Hannah replied. I am a woman who is deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I have been praying here out of my great anguish and grief. Eli answered, Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him. She said, May your servant find favor in your eyes. And then she went her way and ate something, and her face was no longer downcast. Early the next morning, they arose and worshipped before the Lord, and then went back to their home in Ramah. Elkanah made love to his wife Hannah, and the Lord remembered her. So in the course of time, Hannah became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, saying, Because I asked the Lord for him. When her husband Elkanah went up with all his family to offer the annual sacrifice to the Lord and to fulfill his vow, Hannah did not go. She said to her husband, After the boy is weaned, I will take him and present him before the Lord, and he will live there always. Do what seems best to you, her husband Elkanah told her. Stay here until you have weaned him, and only may the Lord make good his word. So the woman stayed at home and nursed her son until she had weaned him. After he was weaned, she took the boy with her, young as he was, and with 3-year-old bull, an ephah of flour, and a skin of wine, and brought him to the house of the Lord at Shiloh. When the bull had been sacrificed, they brought the boy to Eli. She said to him, Pardon me, my lord. As surely as you live, I am the woman who stood here beside you praying to the Lord. I prayed for this child, and the Lord has granted me what I asked of him. So now I give him to the Lord. For his whole life, he will be given over to the Lord, and he worshiped the Lord there. Hannah praises God. When Hannah prayed and said, My heart rejoices in the Lord, and in the Lord my horn has lifted high. My mouth boasts over my enemies, for I delight in your deliverance. There is no one holy like the Lord. There is no one besides you. There is no rock like our God. Do not keep talking so proudly, and let your heart speak such arrogance. For the Lord is God who knows, and by him deeds are weighed. The bows of the warriors are broken, but those who stumble are armed with strength. Those were full hire themselves out for food, but those who were hungry are hungry no more. She who was barren has borne 7 children, but she who has had many sons pines away.
The Lord brings death and makes alive. He brings down to the grave and raises up. The Lord sends poverty and wealth. He humbles and he exalts. He raises the poor from the dust and lifts the needy from the ash heap. He seats them with princes and has them inherit a throne of honor. For the foundations of the earth are the Lord's. On them he has set the world. He will guard the feet of his faithful servants, but the wicked will be silenced in the place of darkness. It is not by strength that one prevails. Those who oppose the Lord will be broken. The Most High will thunder from heaven. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed. Then Elkanah went home to Ramah, but the boy ministered before the Lord under Eli the priest. Eli's sons were scoundrels. They had no regard for the Lord. Now it was the practice of the priests that whenever any of the people offered a sacrifice, the priest's servant would come with a 3-pronged fork in his hand while the meat was being boiled and would plunge the fork into the pan or kettle or cauldron or pot. Whatever the fork brought up, the priest would take for himself. This is how they treated all the Israelites who came to Shiloh. But even before the fat was burned, the priest's servant would come and say to the person who was sacrificing, "Give the priest some meat to roast. He won't accept boiled meat from you, but only raw." If the person said to him, "Let the fat be burned first, and then take whatever you want," the servant would answer, "No, hand it over now. If you don't, I'll take it by force." This sin of the young men was very great in the Lord's sight, for they were treating the Lord's offering with contempt. But Samuel was ministering before the Lord, a boy wearing a linen ephod. Each year his mother made him a little robe and took it to him when she went up with her husband to offer the annual sacrifice. Eli would bless Elkanah and his wife, saying, "May the Lord give you children by this woman to take the place of the one she prayed for and gave to the Lord." Then they would go home. And the Lord was gracious to Hannah, and she gave birth to 3 sons and 2 daughters. Meanwhile, the boy Samuel grew up in the presence of the Lord. Now Eli, who was very old, heard about everything his sons were doing to all Israel, and how they slept with the women who served at the entrance to the tent of meeting. So he said to them, "Why do you do such things? I hear from all the people about these wicked deeds of yours. No, my sons, the report I hear spreading among the Lord's people is not good. If one person sins against another, God may mediate for the offender. But if anyone serves against the Lord, who will intercede for them?" His sons, however, did not listen to their father's rebuke, for it was the Lord's will to put them to death. And the boy Samuel continued to grow in stature and in favor with the Lord and with people. Now a man of God came to Eli and said to him, "This is what the Lord says. Did I not clearly reveal myself to your ancestors' family when they were in Egypt under Pharaoh? I chose your ancestor out of all the tribes of Israel to be my priest, to go up to my altar, to burn incense, and to wear an ephod in my presence. I also gave your ancestors' family all the food offerings presented by the Israelites. Why do you scorn my sacrifice and offering that I prescribed for my dwelling? Why do you honor your sons more than me by fattening yourself on the choice parts of every offering made by my people Israel? Therefore, the Lord, the God of Israel, declares, I promised that members of your family would minister before me forever. But now the Lord declares, far be it from me. Those who honor me I will honor, but those who despise me will be disdained. The time is coming when I will cut short your strength and the strength of your priestly house, so that no one in it will reach old age, and you will see distress in my dwelling. Although good will be done to Israel, no one in your family line will ever reach old age. Every one of you that I do not cut off from serving at my altar, I will spare only to destroy your sight and sap your strength, and all your descendants will die in the prime of life. And what happens to your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, will be a sign to you. They will both die on the same day. I will raise up for myself a faithful priest who will do according to what is in my heart and mind. I will firmly establish his priestly house, and they will minister before my anointed one always. Then everyone left in your family line will come and bow down before him for a piece of silver and a loaf of bread, and plead, appoint me to some priestly office so I can have food to eat.
Well, we are into a whole new chapter. I thought that overview was pretty great. What did you guys see in either the text or the overview that jumped out at you?
The two sons of the priest were nasty fellows.
Mm.
And you would think they were born into something that would have continued, it would have been in them by osmosis. But Samuel, the one that was not born in that church, was very steadfast and true.
Yeah. It is with surprising regularity that faith skips generations and isn't handed and passed down as we would expect or anticipate. And boy, have I watched as women and men of God have lamented on how difficult it is to pass on faith to their own kids. And you see that, I think, they had to have grieved this father's heart, right? I mean, here's a guy who really wants to honorably serve the Lord, and his kids are, like you said, are scoundrels, and I mean, it's not like they've just abandoned casually the faith. I mean, they're using the faith as a power and a weapon. They've weaponized their faith to manipulate the people around them. It's just a horrid scandal, right?
Go ahead.
There was an interesting conversation that I had Wednesday night with a couple of 14-year-olds. And the one was saying their parents were trying to force, basically, her younger sister to accept the faith.
Mm-hmm.
So we chatted that around the room a little bit, and you can't argue anyone. You can't change anyone's mind. A person's mind is their own. And one of the other gals was really profound. And she said, you know what, there's a time to talk and there's a time to be quiet and just model behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought how true that is. And I think we sometimes as parents get really carried away and we just want it so bad that we try to do it in our own power.
Mm-hmm.
And we have no power to do
Right.
that. So all we can do is be a conduit and do our part. And we need to be receptive to our part.
That's really good.
That's profound, Jenny. I think when you're talking about your kids, and one of the things that my daughter has said to me is that I was very concerned with how the others in the church perceived my kids, because as they perceived my kids, I thought they perceived my ministry.
Mm-hmm.
And with Elkanah's kids, when Phineas and his brother, it wasn't just that they were sinning, they were sinning with women that were at the gate of the temple, at the gate of the tent, and who had come to worship and who had come to offer their sacrifices.
Mm-hmm. And
these two guys were taking advantage of their authority and taking advantage of their position.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking, boy, if we are doing that with our kids too, where our kids are representing our ministry, we need, like Jenny said, we need to walk in such a way that not only do our kids see it, but they will follow it.
Mm-hmm. One of the things, I think with our children, it's an obvious place, but there's probably other places too. But this first question today is, what deep desire do you need to turn into earnest prayer and leave before God? What do you guys think? I mean, where in our lives or what would be a place where we could wisely just turn our desires into earnest prayer?
Well, I think that we all deeply desire our families to be reconciled to God. And that whole continuation of that theme that we've been kicking around applies. We need to be receptive to the Holy Spirit and do our part and not any more than our part. Because if we get out of our role, we are mucking it up.
Yeah.
You know, I think now is the time in our church, right, where we really need to hold our church before the Lord. And as Mark moves on to what God has placed him in ministry to do, we need to pray that God brings the right person into the position of lead pastor to do the work that God wants this church to do. And we need to be able to follow the person that God chooses. It's not going to be an easy choice because, Mark, you've done an excellent job. And it's, you know, I really anticipate that what God is going to do in the years to come is going to even far exceed what he did with Mark here as our lead pastor. And, you know, I am just holding both Linfield and Todd up before the Lord because they're filling big shoes. And when I was pastoring, I stepped into a position of a pastor that I had to fill shoes that I was in no way capable of filling.
Yeah.
And that's an important, that's what I would be praying.
Well, Elizabeth and I were talking last night, just in, you know, I handed these batons to these guys, and I think they wantingly and willfully grabbed a hold of them, and I think relatively quickly have discovered that maybe I actually did add value to the organization that they weren't anticipating, because these suddenly got heavy fast. And so I think you're right to want to pray for both of them as they try to navigate this transition season. There are some things that they're discovering quite quickly that because of, I don't know, practice and time, that made it look quite easy. It's turning out to be a little bit tricky, and so they're feeling the weight of it for sure. But I'd also invite you to be praying for me as I'm starting to transition into a new environment, because much like the church is going to at some juncture need to embrace a new leader, we have 256 churches that are on the cusp of experiencing that exact same thing that we'll have to experience as a church. They're experiencing that as the leader of the churches. And so that's not any easy transition either. So, and my staff, bless their hearts, are like, now what do we got? And they have no idea the trouble they're all in for. So, you know, so there's a whole lot of change. And whenever there's change, I mean, there's stress, and whenever there's change, there's incredible opportunity for Satan to come in and create division and disunity and confusion and strife. And so let's be praying that these baton passes happen really relatively seamlessly and with really God's authority and provision, and let's be people of prayer and humbly seeking him in this season for sure, for the church and for other things too. So the church, our kids, anything else that comes to mind that we can bring before the goodness of our great God? What deep desires do you need to turn into earnest prayers, and leave those things, just leave them before God and trust him? Hannah obviously really brought it before the Lord that she would have a child, right? I mean, she brought it before the Lord, and she was so exuberant in her prayers that Eli the priest thought that she
was drunk.
Yeah, I mean, she must have been crying. I imagine her exasperated in her earnest prayer. I mean, if for her to be observed as out of sorts, in such a way that, I mean, it must have been deeply held, crying out to the Lord kind of prayers. And, there's some places where I think we miss an opportunity to
I
really
don't
cry
get
out
her.
to God.
I don't really truly understand her motivation to have a child to give it away.
Well,
That
she was giving it away to the priesthood. She was, or to the service of God. She was saying, God, I will give this child into your service.
So was that her deep desire to produce a child for the service of God? That's now how I read that. She wanted it because she felt deficient, is how I read it. So that just always puzzled me.
He was being put down by the other wife.
Yeah, that was funny too. I mean, that how, not funny and haha, but curious as to, how is it that people that have something can be so cruel to those that don't,
But Hannah had something the other one did not have. She had the love of her husband.
Right.
So things just go around and around and around.
Mm-hmm.
And I was grateful to see that she had other sons and daughters after Samuel.
Right.
After she gave up this promised and vowed gift to the Lord, she had other sons and daughters.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, curious stuff that we weave. So Anna, I see that your hand has been raised. If there's a question specific, you can put it in the chat, or if you want to just fire one off to me, that's fine too. But or maybe you press the raise the hand button by accident. In any regard, go ahead and put something in the chat if you're interested. Let's see here. Let me go back to the questions because I may have, oh, there we go. Lost them for a minute. Why is it important to take our requests to God, do you think?
God is really the only one that can satisfy our requests in the best possible way. And we have very much less power than we think we have. I don't know, a common malady, at least of mine, is thinking that I'm capable and I can do all these things. But when you boil that down, it is not true. It is self-delusion. So the only way to get our needs met in the way they should be met is to request that from God, because he knows what we need. He knows what is best for us.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm trying to think. I think the verse says something like, make your request known to God, for he cares for you.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that knowing that God does care for us is a vital part of understanding God's will in our lives.
Yeah. How do you imagine Hannah felt about carrying through with her promise?
I thought it was interesting that she kept bringing a robe for him every year when she went up to give the sacrifices.
Huh.
She got him clothed.
Uh-huh. What does God mean by the pronouncement, you honor your sons more than me?
Your priorities are screwed up. And he cared more about his sons and not offending them or raising them, whatever that problem was. He cared more about his sons apparently than he cared about the Lord.
Yeah. What do you think, Dave?
I think that as he heard those words, he recognized that his ministry was over as far as ministering before God, because his sons, I don't remember how his sons were killed. I know they died on the same day, but I don't remember how they were killed. And it was his family became more important to him than his ministry before the Lord.
And it's hard in some ways not to feel like you want I mean, in some way, in some healthy way, it feels like your family ought to come first before ministry. But on the other hand, it doesn't feel like it's healthy when it switches and your family comes first before the Lord. And there's there's a funny fine line there, isn't there?
Yeah.
The dance between putting God first and family second, and family first and ministry third, or ministry second. It's like the ordering, positioning our lives properly is a tricky balance. And I think for a lot of people, it's easy to imagine how that could get out of balance so quickly. And it's often seen, I think, in a lot of people's lives where, they have the best intentions, they're young, they feel excited about life and what's in front of them. They get married. And then somewhere along the line, they've gotten their life so out of balance that entertainment is first and work is second and kids are third and wife is fourth and God maybe it fits into the puzzle, rather than flipping the script and having God be first and wife be second and kids be third and job be fourth and entertainment being fifth. They've lost perspective and how quickly and easily it is to get our lives out of whack because we lose the perspective of ordering our lives properly. And when we lose the order, it doesn't matter if you're a priest or a teacher or a doctor or a mailman or a homemaker. When you lose perspective of the ordering of your life properly, everything else begins to sour. And in this case, you have kids that have gone and run amok. The life is out of order, and God isn't, even as the priest, isn't even the most important or the thing that you fear the most. It's making sure that your kids are appeased and that you don't rock the boat.
Don't you find it interesting too that this is the transition that occurs, the transition between the judges, like Samson, and the priesthood, which Samuel is the first priest. And that's not what I mean to say. He's not the first priest, but he was the first prophet. I don't know how to define him, but I do find it interesting that he was brought up and raised by a man who lost his own sons, but he was raised. Samuel was by Elkanah.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So I've gone down too many rabbit holes. I'm sorry, Mark.
Well, let me pray us out that we might make sure that in our lives that we really reprioritize if we need to, or prioritize properly, putting God first and other things after. So, God, we do desire to live our lives yielded to you and to your leading, your Holy Spirit's guidance. And so, God, help us to order our lives properly. Help us to put you first and others after that. And that we would live our lives not as if we're the center, but that you're the center. And Father, help us to build lives that really do honor you. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, gang. Thank you. Thanks, Ginny Lee. Thanks, David. Appreciate you too. And God bless you, gang. Make it a great day.
God bless you, Mark.